I'd like to read out to you aloud today the background information relating to this very seminal album, Autobahn by Kraftwerk. This is an incredibly interesting series of behind-the-scenes information. Autobahn is the fourth studio album by German electronic music band Kraftwerk, released in November 1974 by Philips Records. The album marked several personnel changes in the band, which was initially a duo consisting of Florian Schneider and Ralf Hutter. Later, the group added Klaus Roeder on guitar and flute and Wolfgang Fleur on percussion. The album also completed the group's transition from the experimental krautrock style of their earlier work to an electronic pop sound consisting mostly of synthesizers and drum machines. Recording started at the group's own Kling Klang facility, but was predominantly made at Connie Plank's studio. Autobahn also includes lyrics and a new look for the group that was suggested by Emil Schult, an associate of Schneider and Hutter. Most of the album is taken up by the 22-minute Autobahn, featuring lyrics by Schneider, Hutter, and Schult. The song was inspired by the group's joy of driving on Germany's Autobahns and recorded music that reflected a trip emulating the sounds of a vehicle. The album's release in West Germany saw little press attention. Autobahn was released as a single and received airplay at a Chicago radio station, leading it to spread across the United States. In 1975, the song became an international hit and Kraftwerk's first release of their music in the US. Autobahn's success led to the band touring the United States with new member Karl Bartos, who would replace Roeder, followed by a tour of the United Kingdom. Initial reception to Autobahn was mixed. It received, very stupidly, negative reviews from Rolling Stone and Village Voice's critic Robert Christgau, who felt that the music was inferior to earlier electronic music from Wendy Carlos and Mike Oldfield. I guess he decided he wasn't allowed to like it, and what are you going to do about it, everyone? Fun Christgau. Other critics found the track Autobahn hypnotic and arresting for its imagery of driving on the Autobahn. Critics from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and Newsday included the album in their honorable mentions sections of their year-end lists. Later reception was unanimously enthusiastic. Simon Witter wrote in NME the album is of enormous historical significance, and Simon Reynolds, and our good friend, well, not really, I consider him a good friend, but he has no idea who I am, I suppose, said the album is where Kraftwerk's music really starts to matter. That's an interesting... I really like the first three albums. Reynolds probably didn't listen to the first three Kraftwerk albums until he had a busier schedule in life, so I don't think he spent enough time with them, frankly. That's just my guess. I apologize if I'm mistaken, Reynolds. And I'm just generalizing and judging you for no good reason. Musicians of the 1970s and 1980s, including David Bowie, cited the album as a major influence. Prior to the release of Autobahn, Kraftwerk consisted of Florian Schneider and Ralf Hutter, who had released an album titled Ralf und Florian in October 1973. Prior to Autobahn, electronic music did not develop a popular following in the United States, with a few exceptions such as Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells and the works of fellow German band Tangerine Dream. According to critic Lynn Van Matre of the Chicago Tribune in 1975, far too often much of what has been proffered has been either boring, painfully self-indulgent, or just plain painful. I wouldn't agree. I think electronic music was always really interesting to me, particularly obviously I like the BBC Radiophonic Workshop stuff of the 1960s. There's that great Mark Fisher quote where he claims Delia Derbyshire rendered the entire 60s dated from the moment she had recorded her compositions. It's an interesting thought. Like, she was that ahead of her time. That's a fact. It's true, really, in a way. In comparison, Van Matre found Autobahn to be what you might call middle-of-the-road electronics. Comparing the album's sounds to the group's earlier work, Michael Hooker of the Los Angeles Times noted the music of Ralf und Florian is more traditional compared to that of Autobahn, noting its resemblance to the works of composers Morton Subotnick and Edgar Froesch, that's of Tangerine Dream, rather than the monotonous pulse of Autobahn. Morton Subotnick, the aforementioned, he's an absolute genius, by the way. Look into him. I may have to compose some videos on him at some stage. Kraftwerk became more conscious of their visual image, and under the guidance of their associate Emil Schult, they began redesigning their look. Schult, who had studied under Joseph Beuys, Beuys, however you actually pronounce that specifically, consulted the band on their themes and image. This led to Kraftwerk having small, carefully staged promotional images for the rest of their career. In a 1975 interview published in Melody Maker, Carl Dallas noted Kraftwerk's music and look were as far as you get from the gothic romanticism of Tangerine Dream, and that visually they also present a completely different image, comparing Tangerine Dream's Froesch's untidy red locks and bandmates Peter Bauman's and Christopher Frank's long, lank tresses. Interesting. The album art of Tangerine Dream suggests something far more cosmic than the earthy, ethereal gothic romanticism. Interesting, nevertheless. Interesting. In early 1974, like their German contemporaries, Kraftwerk purchased a Mini-Moog synthesizer, which they used alongside customized version of the Farfisa Rhythm Unit 10 and Vox Percussion King drum machines on the album. Autobahn was recorded at the group's home studio Clean Clang and at Connie Plank's new studio in a farmhouse outside Cologne. The majority of Autobahn was made on Plank's equipment. Accompanying Schneider and Hutter on the album are Klaus Roeder on violin and guitar and Wolfgang Fleur on percussion. Roeder, who was a member of Dusseldorf's music scene, had built an electric violin that intrigued Schneider. Fleur was an interior design student who had drummed for a Dusseldorf band called the Beethovens. Fleur stated that he found initial jam sessions with the group somewhat strange, but soon developed a rapport with his bandmates. Connie Plank is credited as the engineer on the album, but he had a key contribution to its sound. Roeder later said, Plank played a decisive role. He mixed everything and assembled individual sounds into a whole. That was, I believe, the last time that Connie did that. He then told me he did know what Kraftwerk would sound like when he was no longer there. Gee, that's such a non-English speaker's way of speaking English. In the book Kraftwerk Music Non-Stop, Carsten Brocker said with Autobahn, Kraftwerk completed the transition from their earlier style of experimental krautrock to electronic pop music. The album was recorded primarily on synthesizer and drum machine with occasional flute and guitar. Brocker commented on the group's simple melodies and harmonies suggest pop music. According to Bartos, the group's change in style occurred because Hutter and Schneider came from a classical music background and they moved to pop music by adding lyrics because there is no pop music without lyrics apparently. The change in musical direction was influenced by Schult, who was not trained as a musician but has an ear for melody and chose effective parts of improvised sessions, and led Hutter and Schneider to explore by simplifying their own musical sessions. There are very few vocals on Autobahn. Critic Van Matra described the album as simply an impression of the sounds and sensory perceptions of the road. Hutter repeatedly described Kraftwerk's music as industrial Volksmusik, industrial folk music, specifically referencing a modern version of German regional musical traditions rather than the industrial music sound of groups like Throbbing Gristle. In Britain, electronic music was popularly known as Doctor Who music, there you go, referencing the pioneering electronic soundtrack to the television series. Hutter stated in 1975, Kraftwerk got the idea for the album by driving on the Autobahn, stating it was an exciting experience that makes you run through a huge variety of feelings. We tried to convey through music what it felt like. Fleur later described Autobahn as a journey from Dusseldorf to Hamburg and said the route included musical pieces such as the industrial sounds of the Ruhr Valley, the conveyor belts of the mining towns such as Bottrop and Castrop-Rauxel, and the rural Munster region, which is symbolized by the flute in the song. Other sounds of road travel are heard throughout the song, according to Hutter. The group included car sounds, horns, basic melodies, and tuning motors. Adjusting the suspension and tire pressure, rolling on the asphalt, that gliding sound. When the wheels go onto those painted stripes, it's sound poetry and also very dynamic. Autobahn was co-written by Schult, whom Hutter asked to write some lyrics. The song's lyrics are in German. Schneider reflected on this, stating, "Part of our music is derived from the feeling of our language. Our method of speaking is interrupted, hard-edged if you want, a lot of consonants and noises." According to Hutter, their language is used like a musical instrument. He said, "We are not singers in the sense of Rod Stewart. We use our voices as another instrument. Language is just another pattern of rhythm. It is one part of our unified sound." In a 1991 interview, Hutter stated there was no expectations for the release of Autobahn and that we played it to our friends and few of them said, "Fahren auf der Autobahn? You've gone crazy. We just put records out and see what happens, otherwise we'd end up overcalculating this or that." The album's 4 other tracks are shorter electroacoustic pieces. Kometenmelodie was inspired by Comet Kotek, which passed by Earth in 1973. I don't think I pronounced that correctly. Hutter said, Morgenspaziergang, morning walk, was influenced by the group's early morning walk when leaving their studio after late-night sessions, when they observed the silence of their surroundings. The two-part Kometenmelodie was described as post-psychedelic cosmish by Chris Power in Drowned in Sound. Let's read out rather the contemporaneous reviews I'm not that interested in. They were incorrect. Let's read the retrospective reviews in The Legacy. In 1985, Simon Witter wrote in The Enemy, "Autobahn is not as strong as Kraftwerk's 4 subsequent albums." No, I would disagree. I think it's their finest overall, actually. Or Radioactivity, maybe. One of those two, but that it has enormous historical significance. Witter said, in the glam era of glitter and guitars, Kraftwerk were four besuited squares playing keyboards, and that the group was mentally and sonically decades ahead of their contemporaries, noting their unique rhythms, textures, and melodies. Simon Reynolds wrote in the Spin Alternative Record Guide, 1995, esoterics will claim they prefer the first three albums. They're excellent. Oh, but truthfully, Reynolds... Oh man, I spoke too soon earlier. They're excellent, but truthfully, Autobahn is when Kraftwerk's music of the sphere starts to matter. Okay, yeah, he knows. Reynolds knew I was recording this, and he quickly edited it. Damn it. Reynolds said the title track sounds like a pastoral symphony, even as it hymns the exhilaration of cruising down the freeway. David Kavanagh gave the 2009 remaster of Autobahn a 5-star rating in Uncut, saying the title track is its main attraction and called the tracks freckled with warmth, sunny vocal harmonies, mit Glitzerstrahl, a carefree flute solo, Schneider, and clever modulations denoting gear changes to break the tension. Kavanagh called the remastering of the album a fiasco and said it is worse than the compact discs previously released by EMI. Oh, damn. Matt Snow wrote in Mojo, the album is a pop landmark and a blueprint for their entire enterprise. Tom Ewing of Pitchfork commented positively on the album in their review of the catalogue. But I assume it's a compilation. Box set, okay, Kraftwerk. Noting tracks on the album are a showcase for Kraftwerk's gift for simple, wistful melodies, but said the themes explored on the album were done better on Trans Europe Express. Interesting. Maybe. I don't prefer Trans Europe Express, but that could be an argument worth making. On other later album reviews, such as a 4-star rating from the Irish Times and a 3.5-star rating in the New Rolling Stone Album Guide, were generally positive with no specific details on Autobahn because it's too smart for Rolling Stone Album Guide. Chrisco updated his initial ranking of C+ for Autobahn to a B-. Kraftwerk would later sign with EMI to establish the Kling Klang company within. This worldwide licensing deal placed them with Electrola for Germany, Austria and Switzerland, EMI in the United Kingdom, Vertigo in the United States, and PAF Marconi in France. I'm probably pronounced that incorrectly. Feel free to despise and disdain me and mock me for that. No, if you do it elsewhere, the mocking is invalid, frankly. Kraftwerk followed up Autobahn with Radioactivity, which was released in 1975. Kraftwerk did not repeat the high sales of Autobahn on any subsequent album in the 1970s, but were one of the most commercially successful groups in their style, selling well throughout Europe. Hutter and Schneider later dismissed Kraftwerk's earlier music. No. According to Hutter, Autobahn was really the first, and Schneider called the earlier music history archaeology. That's a shame, really. Autobahn was Connie Plank's final work with Kraftwerk. At the home studio where he worked on Autobahn, Plank later worked with groups and artists such as Killing Joke, Clannad, Brian Eno, The Eurythmics, and Devo, as well as German groups such as Nu and DAF. Nu is genius, as we all know, probably. In his review of Sequence in 1976 by Synergy, critic Michael Hooker noted the increasing interest in synthesizer composition since the release of Autobahn. Other artists, such as David Bowie, began noting Autobahn as an influence. Bowie said, "The preponderance of electronic instruments convinced me that this was an area that I had to investigate a little further." Michael Rother stated, Autobahn had an impact on his band Harmonia and led him to start thinking about adding voices on tracks. He said, on Harmonia's Deluxe, you can hear an echo of that. Producer Arthur Baker first heard Kraftwerk's Autobahn when working at record store in high school. He would later use the melody of the group's songs for Planet Rock for Africa Bambaataa. According to Patrick Codneys of the band Front 242, in the early 1970s, most creative groups are virtuosos like King Crimson and Yes, whose music was based around sophisticated jam sessions. When I bought Autobahn, I had the feeling that it was changing. For the first time, it was music that was impossible to touch, not being made up of the usual components of rock. Codney said the music was made by only one person, which helped encourage him to make music on his own. Music critic Simon Frith stated disco heralded the future of music, and said Autobahn was the bridge between 5 minutes of unchanging rhythms of AM radio and the 24-hour concerts by avant-garde musicians like Terry Riley. Author Thomas Jerome Seabrook named the album among the finest Kosmisch records. Kosmisch, that's Kosmisch music, cosmic music in German, that's a term for krautrock, or a branch of krautrock at least. Anyway, if you're not already familiar with Autobahn, do give it a listen. If you're already familiar with it, I imagine I'm preaching to the choir. In any case, I think listening to Autobahn will make one's day possibly one of the best you have ever imagined or ever could imagine. And if one is not Robert Christgau, they are already in a really, really good place to potentially have the best possible day they could ever have. Thanks again, my good and dear friends.